I just wanted to do a quick update on this baby bottle rod dryer chuck. I wanted to update it and show a solid mount that I made for it. What's holding it on is just a paper clip that I bent roughly into the shape of a cotter pin. And I added a little tape on the motor shaft for a little bit tighter fit. I drilled this hole just a little bigger than I needed so it could fit on another motor I've got. And I drilled a hole all the way through in the center. This is made out of a piece of aluminum. The way I made this is I drilled through this end all the way through and tapped it with a 1/4 by 20 tap to fit the screw that goes on the baby bottle and works as the slip clutch shaft for the baby bottle chuck. And I use Loctite on the screw where it threads into this solid mount shaft. Loctite keeps the screw from backing out as you're using the chuck. And then I just drilled this hole out larger than that 1/4 by 20 side so that it would fit over this motor shaft. The reason I did that is because after I had this running for the better part of the day, the vinyl tubing started working its way off of this shaft. It never came completely off, but it had moved quite a bit. So that made me think I probably needed to come up with something a little more sturdy. So I made this shaft to go over the motor and to put the screw into. I made this on a lathe with a piece of aluminum round bar that I had. You don't have to use a lathe. I was looking around online and I saw that you can buy standoffs in aluminum, and I would try to stick with aluminum unless you do have a lathe or a good way to drill holes in steel. Just because aluminum is easier to work with, it's a lot easier to drill. You can buy 1/4 inch threaded standoff spacers in different lengths, and you could cut it to whatever length you needed. And they're already drilled with a 1/4 by 20 hole. You'll need to look for 1/4 by 20 standoffs. It would be real easy then at that point just to open this hole up because the hole's already there and centered. You could just use a gradually larger drill bit until you get to the size you need to go over your motor shaft. I saw that as a solution for people that don't have a lathe. There are ways you can drill centered holes in round stock like this. If you're real careful, you can get it centered up pretty good. It's real easy to do on a lathe, but if you don't have a lathe, then that would be an option, is to buy one of those standoffs. And a lot of the standoffs I saw were hex shaped and some of them are round, and it really wouldn't make any difference one way or the other what type you went with. The hex shape wouldn't affect the setup at all. And then you can just drill a hole right in the center to allow you a spot to put a pin if you have a pin. If you've got a motor shaft that doesn't have a pinhole in it like this one does, it's got a little hole right here. If you do not have a motor like that, what you could do is drill all the way through and then tap that hole and put in a set screw. The size hole you'd need would be so small you probably need to use an Allen headed set screw. Then you could just tighten that down on the motor shaft once you get it installed. And I mentioned in that video originally that I'd used a vinyl tube before to connect to a motor shaft, and that actually worked out just fine. But the difference is that it was sandwiched in between two bearings, so it really could not move one way or the other. And just over the course of the day, I think I had the rod dryer just turning for about 8 hours one day. It eventually started to move on the shaft. So it's just something to keep in mind. You could also, on the vinyl tubing, you could burn a hole through it or even just poke a hole through it. Put a pin in through the motor shaft if your motor has a hole in it like this one, and that would probably keep that vinyl tube in place and you wouldn't have to worry about it. But I just wanted to mention this solid mount up. It's a little more rigid. Now, on these inexpensive motors, there's play in the shaft anyway, but that's fine. I mean, if on a dryer, if it moves up and down a little bit, it's really not going to matter because your rod's going to be in stands. So that's going to keep the rod from moving around. And a little play on this end actually is somewhat desirable. That way it's not trying to move your rod up and down. If something's not quite centered up just right, it'll allow just a little bit of movement here on this end. So I thought I'd mention that. You might want to look at doing a solid mount, or at least if you've got a hole in your motor shaft, putting a hole through the vinyl tubing in order to keep that from walking on you. I have what I needed already to make this up. It didn't cost me anything other than about 10 minutes of time. The standoff would also be a possibility for someone if they didn't have a lathe to make centering up their holes a little easier. There's a lot of ways you can put a center hole in a round rod if you just want to buy some aluminum stock. I'd suggest looking around on YouTube and you'll see guys that have come up with different ways of making sure you get a centered hole when you're trying to do that, and that would be a possibility also. You could just drill on one side and tap it, and then drill on the other side, whatever size you need for your motor, and that would work. So I thought I'd let y'all know about that. And if you did not see the original video about these rod dryer chucks, you can look up here in the top right hand corner, and I'll put a link to the video that shows how to make one of these slip clutch chucks. They work really well. This is just a video updating you on a solid mount that I came up with for it, as opposed to the vinyl tubing that I showed on the original video. That's all I got for today, guys. Y'all take care.